Okay, so in the last lecture, we looked at how the Black Death had helped to hasten the decline of the feudal system and led to a substantial empowerment of the peasantry across Europe, who saw great improvements in their living conditions in the 15th century in Britain and France in particular. We then looked at how the landed classes, the aristocracy, and the wealthy classes and so on, had increasingly turned to trade to increase their wealth as the old feudal system of production collapsed. And we looked at how things like wool farming meant that by the 16th century peasants were being thrown off their land in large numbers to make way for sheep. At that time, by the way, about 3/4 of English exports were woolen cloth. So to cut a long story short, by the 17th century, that is by the 1600s, what Marxists like to call the capitalist mode of production, that is the production and sale of commodities, was well underway. And the class involved in it, which Marxists call the bourgeoisie, were becoming increasingly powerful. You had huge trading companies which had been set up to manage this trade. For example, the Levant Company, trading spices and silks from the Middle East, the East India Company, trading textiles and cotton and sugar and so on with India, the Muscovy Company, importing Russian furs and so on. And obviously those with shares in these companies were doing very well indeed. Then you had, of course, more markets being opened up when in 1492 Christopher Columbus became the first European to land in America. It's thought, by the way, by some scholars that African navigators may have already done that. But Columbus became the first European to get there in 1492, and then at first Spain and Portugal, and then subsequently Britain and France began to colonize the Americas, that is, invade and conquer the land and control it for their own benefit, often working the native inhabitants to death in the gold and silver mines that they found there. And then, as we know, to replace the native workforce they had killed off, they actually began to kidnap Africans and force them to work in the Americas instead, in what became known as the transatlantic slave trade. And Britain soon became the leading power involved in this trade. So in this way, capitalism was, from its inception, always bound up with slavery and colonialism, summed up neatly by Karl Marx in the following quote. And he says, "The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population." Entombment of mines, very graphic description by Marx there, actually describing this process of people literally being worked to death, being entombed. Their tombs became the mines they were forced to work in. The entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, that is India, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. Again, a very, very graphic imagery. A warren that is a hunting ground for the commercial hunting of black skins. He said that's basically the whole of Africa had been turned into that. Yeah. And he said all of this signaled the rosy dawn, he says, he's been sarcastic, the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. So obviously all of those traders and merchants involved in all this were becoming fabulously wealthy. And indeed this new class of merchants and traders, the bourgeoisie, were quickly becoming more powerful than the old aristocracy, and certainly becoming more wealthy than the old aristocracy, that is the old landowners who had been the ruling class under the feudal system, and who in many ways were still the ruling class politically, even though economically their power was on the wane. So, and in fact, the continued political power of the aristocracy and the monarch became increasingly seen by the bourgeoisie as a brake on their growing power and wealth and an obstacle to their continued growth. So I'll just give you two examples of this. So, for example, the bourgeoisie really saw the full commodification of land. That is to say, they wanted land to be able to be bought and sold like any other commodity. So, for example, if a new trading company, and by the way, these trading companies I mentioned, they were somewhere between like a multinational company and an army, private army really. They would often actually conquer territory in order to then trade with it and get the resources and sell goods there and so on. So if a new trading company had conquered a new colonial territory, for example, then it would want to be able to increase the quantity of, for example, woolen goods that it produced in order to sell them in that new territory, for example. So it would need a lot more land for sheep. But the old feudal system and what were called customary rights would make this difficult. Land was not generally something that was sold at that time. Rather, it was passed down through inheritance, right? Or it was allotted to people by the king. Yeah, he would decide who had land, and in that family, the land would stay in that family. It wasn't generally bought and sold. And even if it was, for example, if a land-owning family fell on hard times, became bankrupt, had to sell up, even if one of these kind of bourgeois producers or wool farmers or whatever bought land and they were able to buy land, the chances are often that the local population would often have all kinds of local rights to that land. They would have the right to graze cattle on it, or to fish and hunt on it, or to cut wood from it, and so on. So the new landlord might face legal problems, in fact, if he's tried to simply fence off the land or enclose it, as the term was, and fill it with sheep. He'd be faced with angry commoners demanding their grazing rights, and they would often have the law on their side. So this is the kind of thing this is how this the kind of old feudal system and the sort of structure of government and law that had emerged under the feudal system was kind of proving a kind of blockage to the development of capitalism and the further increase of wealth of this new merchant bourgeois class. Another example, another thing that angered the bourgeoisie was what were called the royal monopolies on trade. So how it worked was only one company was allowed to conduct foreign trade in a particular commodity or with a particular region. So I mentioned the East India Company, for example. That was the only British company that was allowed to trade with India. Yeah, if you or me or Joe Bloggs wanted to start selling shoes in India or whatever, no, it'd be shut down. Only the East India Company was allowed to trade with India, and it was the same for each commodity, each foreign region. There would be a monopoly on that trade. No one else would be allowed to be involved. Only the company with what was called a royal charter would be allowed to trade in that commodity or in that region. And of course the king would often dish out these very lucrative charters to his friends and relatives, or even just to people who gave or lent him a lot of money. So many merchants resented the fact they were being kept out of trade that they could potentially have been very profitably involved in. So essentially what you have by the 17th century, you have this tension building up between the growing economic power of the merchants, the bourgeoisie, and the continued political power of the aristocracy, represented by the monarch, right? So you have increasingly the class that's doing the best in terms of wealth, becoming the richest class is the bourgeoisie, the merchants, but the power over government, control of the state, control of laws, is still in the hands of the king, who more or less represents the aristocracy. And this kind of really came to a head. This tension really came to a head in the English Civil War, which broke out in 1642. So a bit of background: for a long time, England had been ruled by the king with his Parliament, right? And this had been more or less the case since the Magna Carta of 1215. If you remember, when the barons forced King John, they kidnapped him, didn't they? And they rowed him on a boat out to Runnymede on the Thames. They forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which, amongst many other things, forced him to establish a council of barons who he had to consult with over his laws and policies. And this council of barons later became basically the origins of Parliament, the House of Lords. But in this relationship, this governing by the king with his Parliament, the king had always had the upper hand, right? Until the Civil War of the 1640s, the king had always had the upper hand in that relationship. And the king was seen, like I say, as basically the kind of head, it's oversimplified, but the kind of representative of the aristocracy. But Parliament, and especially the House of Commons, was seen as a representative of the merchant class, the bourgeoisie. So this clash between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie that I was talking about manifested in a clash between the king and parliament, right, which broke out in 1642 in the English Civil War. So this is a Marxist interpretation of the English Civil War that I'm giving you here. Remember, the key point about Marxist analysis is that it sees history in terms of class, right, and struggle between different classes. And that struggle is what Marxists see as the driving force, the motor of history and historical events. So there are other interpretations of the Civil War available. For example, some historians would emphasize more the role of religion, highlight the religious differences between the Catholicism of the king and his supporters and the Protestantism of Oliver Cromwell and Parliament. So what I'm giving you here is more of a Marxist account of the Civil War, right? And that it views that event through the lens of class, yeah, and from the different class interests involved. So, again, to cut a long story short, Parliament, led by Oliver Cromwell, won the Civil War, and the King Charles I, lost. King Charles I, was then executed, and the monarchy was abolished. And for 11 years, from 1649 to 1660, England was a republic. That is to say, a country governed without a monarch. But when Oliver Cromwell died in 1660, Parliament actually restored the monarchy, which is why that period is known as the Restoration. They invited the son of the executed king to become king, so he became King Charles II. We'll probably live to be ruled by King Charles III before too long anyway. King Charles II ruled for 25 years without much conflict with Parliament, but when he died in 1685, his brother James II came to the throne, and he, again as his father had done, tried to rule without heeding the wishes of Parliament. And obviously Parliament were very unhappy about this. And so they actually invited the Dutch king. The English Parliament invited the Dutch king, William of Orange, to invade England and overthrow their own king, overthrow James, and take the throne for himself. Which obviously William of Orange was very happy to do, and did. And this event then became known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But Parliament said they would only support him if he agreed to their conditions. And their basic condition was essentially that he could become king, but the real power would essentially from then on lie with Parliament. So they made him sign a Bill of Rights in 1689, which you'll remember we briefly looked at last year when we did the Constitution. And this document effectively established the constitutional principle of, pause the video here, remind yourself what constitutional principle did it establish? That's right, parliamentary sovereignty, right? Pause the video again, just remind yourself what this means. So, parliamentary sovereignty, in other words, the principle that Parliament can make or unmake any law. Okay, so really, the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution between them have really changed the balance of power between King and Parliament. Before the Civil War, you had the King ruling, and Parliament kind of only existed at the King's say-so. He would call it when he needed, basically he'd call it when he needed money, and he'd take it into account their wishes if he wanted to, and if he really needed money he would. But basically the Parliament was there at the say-so of the King. Really what the Glorious Revolution showed was it's the opposite way around now. Really the King was only there at the say-so of Parliament. So the balance, you still, on the face of it, looked like nothing had changed. You still had England before the Civil War was governed by a king with a parliament. After the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, same, but actually the balance of power had completely shifted from king to parliament. So let's pause here and consider what this means. What had happened in the Glorious Revolution in Marxist terms was that the bourgeoisie had taken state power and established themselves as the ruling class. Okay? So Parliament, representing the bourgeoisie, had effectively taken control of the state from the king, representing the aristocracy. So this was the moment when that economic power of the rising merchant class was really converted into political power, power over government, over law, control of the state. So, what was the outcome of this, what we can call a bourgeois revolution, the Glorious Revolution? What did this new class do with their newly established political power? Well, they did a number of things. Pause the video here and have a guess at what kind of things you think they might have done especially given the obstacles to their progress that I outlined earlier. Okay, so here's some of the things that they did with their new power after the Glorious Revolution. So one thing they did, they established a central bank, the Bank of England, in 1694, which basically systematized and securitized the lending of money to the king by the merchants. Secondly, they abolished those royal monopolies I mentioned earlier. So that opened up trade to any merchant with capital, rather than confining it to only one company. And what this did, this led to a massive expansion of foreign trade. Now, in the abstract, this might sound like a good thing, until you remember that the most profitable trade at this time was what? Pause the video and remember or guess. The most profitable trade at that time and for the whole century that followed was actually human trafficking, right? The trade in kidnapped Africans, so-called transatlantic slave trade. So in fact, the Glorious Revolution led to a massive rise in this human trafficking, and the century that followed it, the 18th century, saw millions of Africans kidnapped and shipped to the Americas, devastating Africa's industry and population to such a huge degree it has to this day not fully recovered. In fact, some of the forces who were pushing hardest for the Glorious Revolution were precisely the English tobacco and cotton merchants in the Americas, who wanted more and cheaper slaves for their plantations in the Americas. Right, so on the one hand, in England, you had people who wanted to be involved in the slave trade and therefore wanted to challenge that royal monopoly that the Royal African Company had, being the only company allowed to be involved in the slave trade. Other people wanted to get involved in that lucrative trade. And then the other hand, in the Americas, the English plantation owners in the Americas were finding that that one company, the Royal African Company, was not allowed to provide slaves in the quantity and at the prices they wanted, so they also wanted to open up and expand the trade. So there was a massive increase in that the trafficking of kidnapped Africans, right, or the so-called slave trade. There was also genocidal violence unleashed on the Native American population, as the kind of free-for-all in trade led to an increase in European settlers taking over land in the Americas, which of course meant wars with the native population who were living on the land. All in all, says one recent historian of the Glorious Revolution, Gerald Horne, 1688, he calls it the dawn of the apocalypse for Africans and indigenous Americans. You'll find no mention of this, any of this, in your textbook account of the Glorious Revolution, and you might want to, and we'll try and discuss in class why that might be. What else did the bourgeoisie do with their new state power after the Glorious Revolution? Well, as you might have guessed, many of those customary rights that we referred to earlier that had granted peasants access to land in terms of grazing rights and so on, those were abolished, allowing for the kind of full steam ahead commodification of land, especially through the so-called Enclosure Acts. These are Acts of Parliament between 1750 and 1850 in the main, which made enclosing the land, which remember means fencing it off and effectively barring common people from using it, made that much easier to do. And finally, the 18th century saw a massive ramping up of laws against women, interestingly, especially with the Hardwicke Act of 1753. This act, by this act, married women were stripped of any right to own their own property or even keep their own earnings. They were stripped of any legal protection against domestic violence and even of any right to their own children. Women and everything they produced became by law the property of their husbands. And interestingly, these laws that were being developed in England, stripping women of their status as human beings effectively and redefining them as property and legalizing violence against them, were mirrored at the same time by the laws being drafted in America by English settlers, which did exactly the same thing to the African population there, the African enslaved Africans. So this is, ironically, the historical context in which classical liberalism emerges, based on philosophy, again, very ironically, of natural rights. And it was, in fact, none other than the godfather of liberalism, who we'll be studying in the next lesson, the philosopher of the Glorious Revolution, John Locke, who in his role as colonial governor of Virginia was actually responsible for drafting some of those very laws dehumanizing Africans in Virginia. So that is where we'll leave that talk for now. That is a little bit of, like I said, this is my perspective. This is a Marxist perspective on the unrest and the civil wars and the Glorious Revolution, its causes and effects, and the different classes involved in it in the 17th century. And that 17th century and the Glorious Revolution, that's kind of the crucible in which liberalism really begins to emerge. Okay, thanks for listening.